So the title of my talk is an island called India, Phylogenetic and Diversification Studies in Endemic Hemidactylous Geckos of India Reveals an Adaptive Radiation. Now when we talk about adaptive radiation, islands come to mind. And here's an example of a wonderful adaptive radiation, over 70 species of lemurs in the island of Madagascar. And we all know what adaptive radiation means: high diversification rates, morphological divergence, adaptation to different contrasted niches, and so on. But usually terrestrial systems, when we talk about adaptive radiations in terrestrial systems, it's mostly in islands, right? Now, in my lab, we are interested in looking at biogeography of Indian biota. And while we were studying this, we came across some very interesting patterns, and I'll just discuss that quickly today. Now, background about biogeography of India. The interesting thing about India is that even though it's part of Asia today, 200 million years ago, it was part of the Gondwana supercontinent. It broke apart from Gondwana and eventually collided with Asia about 35 million years ago, carrying with it Gondwanan fauna and flora to Asia. And upon collision, there was exchange of biota between India and Asia. And that actually makes it very, very interesting place to study biogeography. But then India was an island for about 50 million years after it separated from Madagascar and before it collided with Asia. So let's just keep that in mind. Now, after it collided with Asia, the Himalayas arose, the tallest mountains in the world. And what is amazing about Himalayas is it's a huge barrier that separates India from the rest of Asia. So you have a barrier to the north, and to the south you have the ocean. The Himalayas also had a huge impact on the climate of Indian subcontinent. So India today is to the north and the west bound by a very dry climate. So basically India is isolated from the rest of Asia by a physiographic barrier as well as a climatic barrier, though on this side there's some there's scope for movement of taxa. So basically India is like an island to the rest of Asia. So the question is, what about patterns of species distribution, diversification? Do they show signatures of this isolation? So when we started studying systems in India, we discovered something quite interesting. We started observing endemic radiations. So here's an example of an endemic radiation. So this is a phylogeny of a global phylogeny of Hemidactylous geckos, over 100 species of geckos around the world. And here is a radiation from India. So that's Sri Lanka, but India and Sri Lanka together, the Indian subcontinent. There's some back dispersals, but basically over 26 species of Hemidactylous geckos confined to India, all from one common ancestor. So this is when India was colonized, and then there was a radiation. In fact, we started finding endemic radiations in a number of other groups of lizards. So here are some other examples. So in all these cases, there was a single dispersal into India, except for one of them here, followed by a radiation within India, and maybe a few back dispersals in some cases. So here are more examples. These are different groups, number of species in the radiation, when these species made it into India. So basically all this is pointing towards the fact that India is isolated, and that's why you have single dispersals into India followed by radiation. So that got me thinking, what about adaptive radiation? Right? And these are some of the attributes that one uses to identify adaptive radiation. So we were interested in looking at Hemidactylous. Well, that Indian radiation is monophyletic. Then we test for early bursts and speciation, standard methods. The previous speaker already talked about it. And we also look at ecomorphs in this group. So Hemidactylous, very interesting group, over 26 species. I would say probably over 30 species now. A lot of variation in size. That's the smallest one, with the size of a finger, and this would be like over a foot, the big fellow here. There are a number of different ecomorphs: rock dwelling, terrestrial, ground dwelling, arboreal, and you have human commensals. So 4 different ecomorphs in this radiation. So it definitely looks like an adaptive radiation, and this is how, this is the Indian radiation. And as you can see, these ecomorphs have evolved independently along different lineages. So something quite interesting. So we are currently exploring this. So this is the lineage through time plot, and gamma statistics suggests that there was an early burst in speciation, all signatures of adaptive radiation. We also wanted to see if there were rate shifts within the radiation. The reason for that was there is one clade here which is predominantly ground dwelling, but within the radiation there is no rate shift. But what's interesting here is BAM analysis basically shows that early in this radiation there was increase in species accumulation, but later on it's a slowdown. So that's again signs of adaptive radiation. Quickly, morphological analysis. So we have looked at 42 morphometric variables. This is fresh out of the oven, so I'm still trying to figure out how best to analyze this, and I'll be happy to get some inputs from people. So what we have done so far is we have done PCA, log transformed all these variables and size corrected them, and then species were assigned to the following ecomorphs, and then when we did the PCA, the first 4 axes explained 72% of all the variants, and we did a MANOVA on PC 1 through 4. This is what it looks like. And as you can see, there is some separation of some of these ecomorphs, but there's a lot of overlap. But the MANOVA analysis, MANOVA suggests that in most of these species pairs there is significant difference in the morphological axis. However, no significant difference between arboreal and commensal. And we can discuss that if we have the time. All right, and these are some of the variables that are contributing to the differences between these ecomorphs. So the next step really is to try and understand what is the adaptive significance of some of these morphological characters. So much needs to be done. And this is just another way of looking at the morphological data. So we have terrestrial, rock-dwelling, commensal, and arboreal. And as you can see, in many of these ecomorphs, there are certain characters that sort of stand out. So this is another way of looking at some of these characters, and we need to explore this further. Oh, I guess I went really fast. All right. So I think this result is interesting because to the best of my knowledge, and correct me if I'm wrong, adaptive radiations, at least of terrestrial groups, are seen largely on islands. I think this is probably the first case of adaptive radiation which is not on an island. Now, we know that for adaptive radiation, isolation is important, and also availability of unoccupied niches. So what's happening in India? Well, as I mentioned earlier, it was an island for quite some time, and today it's also separated from the rest of Asia because of climatic and physiographic barriers. So it is like an island, but what about unoccupied niches? Well, while India was moving towards Asia, 2 things happened. One is late Cretaceous volcanism, something called the Deccan traps, which caused the extinction of many of the Gondwanan fauna and flora in India. And subsequently, more recently, there was climate change during Miocene, and much of India became sort of moved from humid forest cover to dry environment. And in fact, Hemidaclys is a dry zone specialist. So I think that's what has happened in case of India. There were a lot of unoccupied niches, and it's also isolated. So we see adaptive radiation. In frogs, again, people are finding this. In some frog groups, there's evidence of adaptive radiation in India. So it's exciting result, at least to me. Yeah, I guess that's about it. Thank you.
phylogeny that there was potentially a load of undescribed species, or that you had underestimated the species?
Yes, I think, yeah.
So, I guess my question is, how do you think that would potentially affect these interpretations, and when does an adaptive radiation become a non-adaptive radiation?
Well, when you don't have all those 4 features, so first of all, regarding your question, so it's going to change this when you have a lot of undescribed species, right? So what's going to happen is this part will, you'll have more changes there, and then it does not look like a early burst anymore. I don't think that's going to happen, but we have to wait and see. Okay. So the other question was adaptive radiation.
Yeah.
So typically this is what people use for I listed 4 attributes of adaptive radiation: early burst, adaptation to contrasting habitats, and also phenotype environment correlation. This is something we haven't done. So we are still identifying the phenotypes that are unique to each of those ecomorphs, and then of course, then we have to figure out if those traits actually are actually adaptive, right? So all that has to be done before we actually say that, yeah, this is definitely adaptive radiation. So it's work in progress. And many of these species are impacted. Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
In the hemidactylous radiation, how many species can you find in sympatry?
Oh, so in many places you can find up to 6 species. So 2 rock dwelling, on the ground you'll have 2 terrestrial species, ground dwelling species. Then in the village nearby you'll have commensal, and if there's a large tree you'll have the arboreal. So you can have up to 6 species. So the other radiations in India, they are not adaptive radiations for sure, because those species are allopatrically distributed. Maybe in some places you find 2 species, that's about it. But it's mostly geography that has determined that has driven